series. My name is Shannon Friesen, and I am the Crop Extension Specialist with Saskatchewan Agriculture in Moose Jaw, and we'll be chairing this webinar today. The session will focus on the right rate aspect of 4R. The purpose of this webinar series is to provide a baseline knowledge for the different parts of 4R. We wanted to set these webinars up so we can use it as a reference in the future when we do extension on more in-depth soil topics and have recordings that people can reference for background material. The 4R Nutrient Stewardship Program was created by Fertilizer Canada, and so today we have a few slides to touch on that. So 4R programming in Western Canada. 4R Nutrient Stewardship is an innovative approach for fertilizer best management practices. This approach considers economic, social, and environmental dimensions of nutrient stewardship and is essential to sustainability of agricultural systems. The agricultural industry, government, and conservation authorities are committed to sustainable food production. 4R Nutrient Stewardship provides a science-based framework for implementing, validating, and communicating those efforts. The concept is simple. Apply the right source of nutrient at the right rate, at the right time, and in the right place. But the implementation is knowledge intensive and site specific. Fertilizer Canada currently offers the 4R designation program in Western Canada. This is a voluntary program for Canadian agri-retailers. There are several steps for a retailer to become 4R designated and to report 4R acres. Step 1 is education. CCAs will complete the required 4R nutrient stewardship training. Step 2 is 4R attestation. By signing the 4R attestation form, you will successfully become a 4R designated agronomist. Your agri-retailer can also become 4R designated by signing this form. Step 3 is speaking to your grower customers. Resources are available to help you discuss the program and to sign up customers. Step 4 is to get the acres counted. So as the 4R designated agronomist, you will collect all 4R grower plans submitted to you for approval, and you will enter this online in the 4R acre report. Step 5 is that there are many resources available. These include a 4R designation poster, a 4R nutrient stewardship infographic, and a 4R designation brochure. In the province of Saskatchewan, there are currently 53 4R designated agronomists. This year was also a record breaker for the designation program. The 4R designated agronomists have submitted a total of 3.3 million acres to Fertilizer Canada. Just under 1.5 million of the acres came from the province of Saskatchewan itself. Fertilizer Canada is excited to see the building of the program and hopes to continue this trend as we work towards our target of 15 million validated acres by 2021. They encourage agronomists who haven't yet gone through the program to become a 4R designated agronomist and to start the process today. You can learn more by visiting Fertilizer Canada's website. So we will start the day with a webinar followed by live Q&As. The main hub for today will be your webinar screen, and we will share any relevant information with you through there. The entire session will be recorded, so if you miss anything or wish to revisit any of the presentations, you will be able to. Recording and video links will be sent out later this week, along with event evaluations. So please ensure that you fill the evaluations out, as these help us determine what topics you want to learn more about and help us to prioritize research needs in the future. If you are a CCA, you need to attend live to get the credits. So when you signed up for the webinar, you should have entered your CCA number, and we will make sure that it is passed on to Prairie CCA. However, if you have any questions regarding the CCA credits from today, please contact Ali Noble directly at ali, ALLIE.noble, NOBLE, @gov.sk.ca. So we have a few housekeeping notes to keep in mind during the webinar. If anybody has any questions, you may type them in the question box in the bottom right-hand corner of your control panel. We will try to get to as many as we can, but we may need to limit them due to time. Your question will remain anonymous and will only be sent to me, and you will also be muted during the presentation so that we can ensure there is no feedback that will interfere with the audio. So we will start the day off with the webinar from our crop extension specialist, Samantha Marcino and Mike Brown. So Samantha Marcino is a crops extension specialist out of the Yorkton Regional Office. She has a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture Business from the University of Saskatchewan and has her professional agrologist designation as well as her certified crop advisor. Michael Brown is the crops extension specialist out of the Humboldt office. He holds Bachelor of Science in Agriculture from the University of Saskatchewan and is an articling agrologist and certified crop advisor. He also spends his winters escaping to mountains, thinking about the summer, and he spends his summers sunburnt, thinking about winter. So with that, we'll just bring up Sam and Mike's presentation and begin whenever you are ready. So just bear with us for 1 second here.
All right, do we got the right screen up there, Shannon?
Yes, sure do.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you for that introduction, Shannon. Yeah, my name is Mike Brown. I'm the crop extension specialist out of the Humboldt Regional Office, and I will take you through the first half of this presentation, and then we'll hand it over to Samantha. She'll take you through the second half, and then we'll get to some questions. So yeah, today we're looking at right rate. So some of the principles here, get this slide advanced. So these are the 4R right rate principles. I won't get crazy in depth on them. They're taken straight from the 4R pocket guide. So if you open up that little control box on the side and go into the handouts, there's a PDF for our pocket guide. This is straight out of there. So the right rate principles, we're looking to assess plant nutrient demand, assess soil nutrient supply, assess all of our available nutrient sources, predict our fertilizer use efficiency, consider the soil resource impacts, and then considering rate-specific economics. So through this presentation, we're going to look at some of the influences on what might change your fertilizer rate. So your soil characteristics, your soil type, your cation exchange capacity, the organic matter, ways to determine your right rates. So looking at like a yield maps, variable rates, the crop removal rate charts, soil sampling, and using your soil sampling test results to determine fertilizer rates. So satellite imagery, a couple of laws there. So we got Liebig's law and then the law of diminishing returns, and then some weather related changes. So in under dry conditions, you're going to want to knock back that fertilizer rate if you're putting it in the seed row. We'll look at the macros and their rates, and then some fertilizer use efficiency and some enhanced efficiency fertilizers. So to start off with here, soil characteristics. So soil characteristics play a big part in setting your rates depending on what type of soil you're on. All soils have different percentages of sand, silt, and clay contents, and your rates are going to vary on the type of seed you're putting down there as well too. So you know, your cereals can handle a lot more seed place nitrogen and phos than your smaller stuff such as like, you know, canola and flax. We're going to base these rates too on your opener size and your row spacing. So you can see here we've got some seed bed utilization numbers, and you know, it's, let's say for example you're running a 1-inch knife opener on a 10-inch row. You don't have that number here for a seed bed utilization. The calculation there is going to be your spread on your opener divided by your row spacing multiplied by 100. So you'd be 101 divided by 10 times 100. You're looking at 10%. So if you're doing you know, a cereal grain on a loam soil, you'd be looking at anywhere from 20 to 25 pounds of seed place nitrogen as your safe rate in there with that 10% SBU. As you get into the heavier soils, more clay, you're going to allow higher seed placed fertilizer rates, whereas your sandier soils, you're going to be opposite. You're going to be running lower seed placed fertilizer rates. And all of these charts here are based on excellent soil moisture. So yeah, like I said before, if you've got dry soil, you're going to want to probably kick those rates down by about 50% in those seed beds that are dry or prone to drying. So cation exchange capacity, this has been touched on in a few of the presentations earlier this week. So the ability of the soil to absorb, hold, and release positively charged ions. Your higher your cation exchange capacity, more cations you're going to hold in that soil solution or on that soil. Cation exchange capacity influences soil pH, soil's ability to hold nutrients, the reaction to fertilizers, and buffers against acidification. And it's measured in milliequivalents per 100 grams of soil or centimoles positive charge per kilogram. So depending on if you get a soil test, it might show up as one or the other. If you're more used to one measurement and it shows up on the soil test as the other, they are a 1-to-1 conversion factor there. Continuing on with the cation exchange. So when you get those soil tests back and you look at that cation exchange capacity in the soil test, it'll give you that measure and the mill equivalents or the centimoles, and you can kind of get an idea of your soil texture just from that cation exchange capacity. As you can see here, we run anything less than a 10 is going to be more into that sand soil. 10 to 20 is your sandy loam to loam, 20 to 30 silt loams, clay loams, and then over 30 you're into those heavier clays. Organic matter does have high cation exchange capacity, but organic matter is still only going to be a fraction of the percent of that soil composition. So when you look at these soils, 11 to 50 cation exchange capacity, you're likely going to have a higher clay content. You're going to have that high pH buffering capacity, greater capacity to hold nutrients to depth, and you'll have that higher water holding capacity. When you're dealing with those sandier soils, you definitely have lower pH buffering. You're more likely to leach nutrients, and your water holding capacity is going to be a lot lower. On the organic matter side of things, so this organic matter in the soil, plant, animal, microbial portions, various states of activity and decay, it's always moving. Contains about 5% total nitrogen, mostly in organic, so this has to break down to get released to the soil solution. We're looking at 1% organic matter can release anywhere from 10 to 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre each year. You're going to see higher release during warm, wet months. Due to increased microbial activity, you're going to get that, if you remember from John's presentation earlier, nitrogen release is going to slow down to basically almost zero once you get into those cooler months. There still might be some activity occurring. And also, if you're dealing with the drier summer, you're going to have lower amounts of nitrogen release from that organic matter as well. So we look at that amount of carbon in the organic matter can affect that amount of nitrogen release too. So that carbon nitrogen ratio of 20 to 1 is kind of that tipping point a little bit. If you're less than that 20 to 1 ratio, you're going to have net mineralization and release of nitrogen. If you're above that 20 to 1, you're going to have net immobilization and you're going to have that nitrogen tying up in the organic matter. So some examples there, that 20 to 1 might be breakdown of like a cereal straw, whereas or greater than 20 to 1 would be like a cereal straw residue breaking down. Less than 21 could be like a pulse crop residue, or say like a manure application. You would have a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio. So some benefits of organic matter. So it's going to improve your soil physical condition. It's going to increase your water infiltration, your water holding capacity and aeration. It's going to improve your tilth, your structure, increases the soil's cation exchange capacity. It supplies multiple plant nutrients, so not just nitrogen. It'll buffer against the pH changes, and it also acts as a food source for soil microorganisms. So now we'll kind of start getting into a little bit of variable rate and some tools here. When we talk about variable rate in 4R on the rate side of things, variable rate it's definitely a part of rate, but it's a little bit more of a high level part of 4R rate. You could argue that you can just take out variable there and put fertilizer in and use these tools to make a broad acre fertilizer rate that's accurate as well. So we're going to start off here with some yield maps. They report show report of past productivity, likely not going to provide reasons for the variability. So here we have, this was a corn soybean rotation at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. You can see there's some variability in the center of this field, and then in 2002, it looks like they put an irrigation pivot in, and there's still that variability there. So you can probably assume this variability is likely not due to moisture limitations. When you're building these yield maps too, you do have to calibrate the monitor in the combine. You're gonna have, from when you start combining the field, you're gonna have like that 10 to 12 second delay before the clean grain elevator starts to fill up and it starts actually recording that yield. Same when you finish the field and you stop combining at that pass, you're going to have that 10 to 12 second delay while that clean grain elevator empties out too. So that's something you have to take into account when you're calibrating that monitor for yield maps. These do show yield, like I said before, but no explanation further than that. So, make sure if you're going to use yield maps, you use them in combination with some other stuff as well. Satellite imagery, this is another tool you can use to help identify your productive and non-productive areas of the field. Usually you'll use like an NDVI satellite imagery technology for it. That's going to show your plant growth and vegetation cover. Higher your NDVI, the greater the relative biomass production. This can also be very closely related to the yield maps, as your higher biomass is usually going to equal higher yield, but this isn't always the case. So the satellite imagery we have here, so this was a DOT project I was a part of last summer. It was a project titled for our application on established forages. And at the top here, we have satellite imagery from early May, right around the time we went and broadcasted some fertilizer on this site. Here was a application, the satellite imagery from June, mid-June. You can start to see it was relatively dry, but you're starting to see a little bit of yield difference in that NDVI or color difference. And then at the bottom here, we have the imagery from July, mid to end of July, right before the field was cut for the first cut. And you can see at the top of the field, we do have our area where we had that untreated check, and then below was all the fertilizer treatment. So you can definitely see there was an increase in biomass there. Topography maps. So these are something you can use to identify your changes in elevation. This could have impacts on, organic matter percentages, water holding capacities, water and nutrient movements, A-horizon thickness. This is a pretty popular picture, so I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. But you can see in the lower areas where you're collecting higher moisture, probably a little bit higher organic matter, and then your knolls you're starting to see erode a little bit, and probably the B horizon poking out there. So your knolls and your hilltops, you're going to have thinner A horizons, due to water, wind, tillage erosion, gravity collecting those into the depressional areas. Moisture and nutrients are going to accumulate there as well. Your rolling landscapes, you're going to have less variability from your knolls to the depressions versus something, say, like a hummocky landscape. Soil zone maps. So this is off of SAFSIS. If you haven't checked out SAFSIS, I highly recommend it. It has basically taken all the soil surveys conducted in the province and put them on a digital platform. So when we look at soil zone maps across our province, you remember the from Ag 111 or Soils 240, Hans Jenny's equation there. Soil formation is a function of climate, organisms, topography, parent material, and time. So our soil zones in Saskatchewan, when we look from the brown to the dark brown and blacks, are mostly influenced by that climate. So as you move from the southwest to the northeast, you're going to see annual precipitation increases. It's going to increase your organic matter and in turn lead to darker soils. Texture map. So this can give you an idea of what kind of texture you're dealing with in your field. Determines, that rate on, if you're in a sandier soil, you might be looking at a lower rate. And if you remember from yesterday as well too, those sandier soils might be something to look at for like a split application if you're at a high risk of leaching away stuff that's getting sideband placed. Texture does have an influence on your cation exchange capacity. So finer texture soils, you're going to have higher CEC. You're going to increase your soil's ability to hold nutrients. And I always like to point out when we see that big area on the Regina Plains of that fine texture stuff, that was from the settlements from the glacial lacustrine deposits of glacial Lake Regina. Soil moisture map. So this one here is from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. It's very broad acre. It's not accurate down to field scale. This one was taken in June 1st, last summer, and this is taken satellite imagery from the soil top 5 centimeters. There are options out there if you want more accurate field scale readings, but this is one that you could use just to get an idea of the general region you're in and what type of soil moisture you're coming into the seeding seeding season with. Electrical conductivity maps. So these can show areas that may impact your yield due to salinity levels, areas that can have surface or groundwater depositing soluble salts. So you can see we got some spots in the province down in the southeast here, some slight salinity issues in that Weyburn Estevan area where there's quite a bit of solonetzic soils, and then quite some severe limitations here southeast of Humboldt around the Quill Lakes. So electrical conductivity can decrease yield as salinity increases. So let's say you're dealing with something in the range of like a 4 to 8, you're going to see wheat yields potentially being reduced by 30%. You're going to want to look at changing your fertilizer rate accordingly there too. So if you're don't be fertilizing for 100% yield if your yield's going to be knocked back by 30% due to that electrical conductivity. So soil sampling is part of it. Soil sampling is going to give you your macro and micronutrient levels. It's going to give you your organic matter, your pH. You can base your texture off of your soil sampling test based on that mill equivalent chart we talked about earlier. You can get an idea of kind of what your soil texture is if you haven't hand textured it out or got it sampled for texture. You'll get your cation exchange capacity and your base saturation, and then your electrical conductivity as well. So we've got different methods of soil sampling depending on what you're looking at doing for that field. So a composite sample is going to be an average across the field. Generally, you'll take it kind of on neutral areas like a mid-slope. It won't show variability across the field. It's going to be just a combination of samples and sent in as one. Benchmarks, you're going to be going after the same location year after year. You're going to track your nutrient changes, and usually the benchmarks will be in line with some type of management zone. Grid sampling, so this grid sampling is common if you're going into like a high accuracy variable rate prescription. It can be expensive depending on the size of your grids. Like if you're doing a 1 acre grid across a full section, you got a lot of soil samples you're sending in. And management zone sampling. So this is samples from areas that could be managed separately. So in this example here, you've got your highs, your mids, and your lows on that side. And the tests are only as good as the sample they're taken. So we deal with a 1 acre furrow slice on a loam soil on 0 to 6 inch. You're looking at about 2 million pounds of soil. Quarter section on that same soil is going to be 320 million pounds. And if you do a composite, you're sending in one soil test sample that weighs a pound. So you're sending in 3/10 millionths of a percent of a quarter section. So, you know, if you want to get build a good fertilizer prescription or get good accurate results, you need to take a good accurate sample. So here's an example of some soil test results. You can see you've got your organic matter, your macros, some pH. There's a buffer there that's blank. You're not going to get a buffer pH unless your soil pH is under 7%. Base saturation, cation exchange capacity. So I went and took the soil test and I put those cation exchange capacity numbers into that texture chart. And this one looks like it fits into a loam to silt loam is my likely guess there. Soluble salts. So when this one was blank, it wasn't tested for soluble salts, but you can see here it's millimoles per centimeter. And when I talked about the electrical conductivity previously, it was in millisiemens per centimeter. And those are a 1-to-1 as well too. So if something comes up in here, you can use it as the same from that millisiemens chart, electrical conductivity chart previously. And this might be one of the biggest parts of the variable rate side of things. This is one of those intangibles. This isn't something you can measure, but producer knowledge. They're going to know the field best, likely. They've been around that field for a long time. They're going to be able to identify areas of concern. So things like old yard sites, any past manure applications, disease or weed cycles that are, you know, something that might be something to watch for. And they see the crop grow from seeding to harvest. They can identify areas of concern during that season and look at it more carefully after harvest. So here we'll just talk about again, variable rate summary, but you could scratch out variable rate summary and just input fertilizer rate summary, because all those tools, you don't necessarily need to use them and they're not strictly for variable rate. So a good program, you're going to include multiple tools to make up your management zones if you're going that direction. High quality VR prescription or even a fertilizer prescription, regular fertilizer prescription is built from high quality data, and then making sure you're putting that fertilizer where it's required most at the right rate. And now I will hand over the presentation to Samantha, and she will take you through the second half.
Thanks, Mike. As stated before, my name is Samantha Marcino, and I'm the Crops Extension Specialist out of the Yorkton office. So to start off my half, we'll start with Liebig's law of the minimum, which states that growth is controlled not by the total amount of resources available, but by the scarcest resource, whether it be a nutrient or other factors such as water or sunlight. So essentially, if we look at this barrel, you could keep on pumping up your nitrogen in a crop, but if you're lacking water or phosphorus, those are going to be your limiting factors. So you still won't get the yield potential out of the nitrogen that you're putting down. The law of diminishing returns is an economic-based theory that after some optimal level of capacity is reached, adding an additional factor of production will result in a smaller increase in output. So you can see on the chart there, but essentially for fertilizer rates, it's the point where every dollar spent on fertilizer input would lead to less than $1 return. So economically speaking, for rates, producers should use both to determine the best economic return, because that's what they're really looking for. There we go. Okay, now we're going to go through a couple of nutrients separately. So crop nutrient uptake and removal for nitrogen. Rates need to be balanced with other nutrients and moisture levels. Soil sampling will give you a snapshot of nitrogen levels, but it's only a snapshot on the exact day that you took that sample. So for example, if you take it in the fall, for spring fertilizer, some of that nitrogen can still be lost through processes such as leaching, denitrification, or volatilization. Soil test N levels, organic matter, and previous crop N credits can alter the rate of nitrogen. So as Mike said, organic matter will release nitrogen throughout the growing season. And N credits really is just applying to, if you grow pulse or peas, you can sometimes account for some extra nitrogen throughout the growing season. If we look at our chart here, it breaks it down yield, and then how much goes into the grain and the straw and total uptake. But on the far side, it shows you total pounds of N per bushel. So then you can figure out whatever bushel target you're going for, you can figure out how much nitrogen you'll actually uptake for that crop. This is just the changes in nitrogen uptake. John had this in his presentation yesterday. Nitrogen is mobile within the plant, so even though uptake happens pretty early, the plant's able to move that nitrogen throughout the plant to where it needs it later on in the growing season. Okay, moving on to phosphorus. So there's very low residual levels across Saskatchewan. Irrigation and Crop Diversification Corporation, which is known as ICDC, Agri-Armsite, and Outlook, acquired research land with 2 parts per million soil test P, which is incredibly low and not a good thing. Soil test P you can test for in a couple ways. There's Bray-P1, Malic-3, which is for neutral or acidic soils. There's Olson or bicarb, which is for neutral or alkaline soils, which is fairly popular in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. Then there's the modified Kelowna, which is Chian, Shano, and Caramanos, which works on most soils in the northern Great Plains. And then same thing as the nitrogen chart, breaks it down by bushel, what goes into the grain, goes into the straw, and then your total uptake of P2O5 per bushel. So I know we've seen this chart probably in every presentation this week, but it's a fairly important one. The safe rates really differ depending on crop. So these rates are from the government website, and these are based on knife openers with a 1-inch spread and 9-inch row spacing with good to excellent soil moisture. And then to figure out your actual P2O5, which is what this chart represents, you can multiply your fertilizer rate by the percent P in the guaranteed analysis to get P2O5. So the example there, if you're applying 50 pounds of 1152, 50 times 52% is 26 pounds of actual phos, or your P2O5. Okay, potash has a very high salt index. So oilseeds, pulses, and forage crops have a very low tolerance for seed place K. The total of P and K applications should not exceed the total P safe levels from the previous slide. So if you want to put both with the seed, you have to add both together and they can't exceed those amounts. And then again, same thing on the chart. You can see though on potash, the straw uptake is significantly higher than the other ones because lots of it stays in the straw, especially in the cereals. Then just another chart for potassium recommendations for Saskatchewan crops, and it's broken down by cereals and oilseeds, barley and pulses, grass, hay, alfalfa, and clover. One thing to keep in mind, this is pounds of potash per acre, not ppm off your soil test. Okay, moving on to sulfur. Canola, flax, and alfalfa are high users of S. Deficiencies are more likely to occur on soils that are sandy, low in organic matter, or gray soils. If it's immobile on plants, so a continuous supply is needed from emergence to maturity. So it's not like nitrogen. If it's in the plant, it can't move around. It just stays where it is. And I know we've discussed sulfate versus elemental already, but like Shannon said Monday, elemental takes years to break down. It could definitely be a part of sulfur management plan, but be aware of the limitation in the year of application. It's best to broadcast elemental to break down faster through freeze-thaw cycles and wet-dry cycles. So sulfur is very variable in the soil and sometimes difficult to read off a soil sample. So sometimes we just go on a nitrogen sulfur ratio to see how much your crop would need for that year. So canola and flax is generally a 5 or 6 nitrogen to 1 pound sulfur ratio. Barley and oats is 8 or 9 to 1, and spring wheat is 10 to 1. So for example, if you're looking for a 50 bushel canola crop, and that's going to need 3.3 pounds of N per bushel, you need 165 pounds total nitrogen. So if you use a 5 to 1 ratio, 165 divided by 5 would be 33 pounds of sulfur is what your crop would actually need. And then this chart really just highlights how much canola and flax really use pounds per bushel. They're super high users. So nitrogen fertilizer use efficiency. Crop use of applied N is generally less than 100%. In Western Canada, nitrogen use efficiency is about 50% for cereal crops and 30 to 40% for oilseed crops, which isn't great. Nitrogen use efficiency tends to decrease as the amount of nitrogen applied increases. So even though you apply 100 pounds of nitrogen, doesn't mean your crop will access that entire amount the first year. Some will become immobilized and a certain portion will be lost to either leaching, denitrification, or volatilization. So phosphorus fertilizer use efficiency. The efficiency of fertilizer phosphorus used by crops ranges from 10 to 30% in the year that it is applied. The remaining 70 to 90% becomes part of the soil phos pool, which is released to the crop over the following months and years. So this is why it's incredibly important to not let your phosphorus levels get down and continually build those levels year after year. Many plants will increase root growth when they contact a concentrated source of P, example in a fertilizer band, allowing the plant to use the P more efficiently. Using ammonium-based fertilizers, phos fertilizers, can increase availability of P for plant uptake through changes in the rhizosphere pH or encouragement of root spread into the fertilizer reaction zone. Very high rates of N bounded with P may delay P uptake because the high impact of ammonium, nitrate, and salt can prevent roots from reaching the fertilizer. If other nutrients are limiting crop production, the crop cannot effectively use applied P, restricting yield and P use efficiency. Okay, moving on to enhanced efficiency fertilizers, and I know these were touched on in the last 3 presentations as well. There are many kinds available on the market to decrease leaching, volatilization, and increase seed safety. So there are physical ones like polymer-coated urea or sulfur-coated urea, or chemical ones like NBPT, DCD, nitropyrin, or pronitridine. So the NBPT are urease inhibitors. Those block the urease enzyme from converting urea to ammonium. DCD, nitropyrin, pronitrogen are nitrification inhibitors. These delay the conversion of ammonia form nitrogen to the nitrate form, which is vulnerable to leaching and denitrification. So in conclusion, consider factors that can affect fertilizer rates, such as soil type, characteristics, soil tests, what nutrients we're looking at, economics, law of the minimum, crop selection and uptake rates, fertilizer formulation and placement. And seeing as this is our last of the 4 presentations, I think we can now see the synergy of all 4 together. So there's a synergy of source, rate, time, and place. And it's really hard to think of one without consideration for the others because they all have a certain amount of overlap and they all apply to each other. And that's the end of our presentation. Mike and I will take any questions that you guys have.
Great, thank you so much, Mike and Sam. As a reminder, if anybody has any questions, please enter them into the question box on the bottom of your control panel. So our first question is, can you determine the C to N ratio from a soil test?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. John or Kim, we have John and Kim from the previous presentations on here too. I'm not sure. Do you guys have any input on that?
The carbon nitrogen ratio is actually referring to the ratio of carbon and nitrogen in the crop residue on the surface. You know, you could probably ask a lab if you sent them the residue, but in most cases, they would probably be using, you know, kind of book values. Although it is something that the labs, some of the labs anyways, would build into the calculation for the rate, because depending, you know, if they may ask what was the previous crop, so then they would, you know, build that into the calculation about whether we're going to have a lot of mineralization or very little. So it's actually referring to the crop residue on the surface.
Great. Our next question kind of builds on that. Is the actual ratio like 20-1 or 25-1?
I don't think it's actually just a hard number on it. I think it's more in the range of kind of that 20 to 30 side of things. Now, when you look at the actual numbers of certain residues and things like that, they can definitely, you know, you're going to be looking at some that are over 200-1, and then, you know, your manures and your pulse residues are going to be lower than that 20 to 30 area. But you know, I don't think it's going to be a hard number of, okay, if we're at 24, it's going to do this, and when we're at 26, it's going to do that kind of thing. It'll kind of be fluctuating and mobile, you know, day to day on moisture conditions, temperature conditions, and things like that.
Great, thanks. Next question. When creating a fertilizer recommendation, what value of pounds per acre of nitrogen are you accounting for that's being released by organic matter? 10 to 40 pounds is a large range. Are there any ideal conditions when you might use one value, i.e. dry conditions, are you using another?
Well, for myself, so when I did a calculation for that Adopt project last year to figure out the fertilizer rate, and from what I used, actually, let me just, I have it written down here. I'm just going to pull it up and read it. Just going to close that panel. All right, so what I used is, for my numbers, I used per 1% organic matter on a soil test is going to result in 11.2 pounds of nitrogen released in a growing season. And that was kind of my hard numbers. Now, when I went through, that was really calculated out. To get there, I had 14 pounds per acre per organic matter percent. 80% of that is available in the crop year. So I took, 14 pounds per 1%, multiplied that by 80 pounds. And then in the drier conditions, because we did go into quite dry conditions when we did that project last year, I did knock it back by 25%. Mineralization can increase by up to 25% in higher than average moisture conditions, and then in drier conditions it can be up to 25% lower there. So that was the number I used. And then yeah, so when it worked out to figuring out the ENR on the actual organic matter there, I think it was about just a hair under 8 pounds, or right around 8 pounds when I calculated in the drier conditions.
Great, thanks, Mike. The next question is for Samantha. For Liebig's law, is there any literature on which nutrients are the limiting factors for uptake, or is the law more of a guideline that just says to fertilize for everything?
It'd be more of a guideline. It depends on your soil and what would be lacking, because I mean, everyone's soil is so significantly different. But even if you did a soil sample to see where your levels are at, you'd probably have a good idea of what your limiting factors would be. And that, like in a year like last year, the limiting factor is water. It doesn't necessarily have to be a nutrient.
Great. Next question. For a variable rate application, should the high spots be tested separately from the mid slope and from low spots, or could you in fact combine those samples together, or does it depend on the field?
I guess it depends on what you're looking for and how accurate you want to get on that variable rate, really, and what those highs and low spots look like. So, you know, if your highs and lows aren't, if the distance between your highs and lows isn't crazy and you're not dealing with lots of erosion like we saw in that one picture, you could probably look at putting, you know, areas together if they're not going to be very, very targeted in a variable rate program. Now, if you want to go like high accuracy variable rate and you've got actuators per opener and you're looking like within every 10 inches changing your fertilizer rate, then you're going to want to definitely look at doing those hilltops and mid slopes and foot slopes all sampled separately.
Great. Next question. Could you remind us what a hummocky field or soil looks like?
You bet. I'll just go back to that slide here. Just got to go grab my computer charger. I got the low battery warning. I'll be right back.
Maybe in the meantime, we'll move on to a separate question. Could you comment on the new soil health tests?
Yeah, I guess I could give a comment on it. I don't know if there's any hard and fast numbers set out to look at on a soil health test, and every lab does it differently. It'll give you a snapshot in time, just like everything else, but I don't know of any like certain parameters, you know, like your organic matter should be here, this should be here. It just kind of gives you a guideline.
Great. Next question. When calculating safe seed rates, should you calculate the nitrogen separately from the phos and the potassium?
Yeah, it is calculated separately, and there is, I think Mike had the chart for safe nitrogen rates. So you take the nitrogen that's in your phos, that adds up to your total nitrogen, as well as any other nitrogen you put with it. So you do count the nitrogen from your phos, but it goes into the total nitrogen safe rates.
Great, and kind of building on more seed placed safety. In a sandy soil or soil with not adequate moisture, is there a way to estimate how much less fertilizer you would put in the seed row safely?
I don't know if there is a certain number that you could use. John, do you know of anything?
Actually, the chart we use for safe rates of seed placed is based on different soil textures. So there is, as an example, the 10% seed bed utilization for cereals, you could probably go as high as 30 pounds per acre in the seed row on a clay soil, whereas on the sand, you could be down to 10 or 15 pounds. So it is based on soil texture, and but the chart we use is based on soil texture with the qualifier that it's assumed that soil moisture is good. So if soil moisture is also limiting, as Mike had indicated, you might even want to build in a 50% safety margin. So on a dry clay, instead of putting 30 pounds, you would only put 15. And that's all just ensuring that we aren't damaging the seedlings as they emerge.
Great, thanks. Just a comment about the soil health tests. Kate Congreaves at the U of S is developing a soil health test that would be uniform. So just to make everyone aware that there may be something a little more localized coming down the pipeline soon. So the next question, I don't know if Mike's back yet or not, but if you guys could actually go through a fertilizer recommendation using the soil test sample in this presentation. That would be for canola for 45 pounds per acre target yield. Even just a general overview of how you might calculate those numbers based on removal rates, organic matter, etc.
I'm assuming Mike's not back yet.
I'm here.
Oh, you are? Can you flip it back to the soil test result sheet?
You bet. There we go.
Yeah, so like Mike said earlier, everyone kind of uses different numbers based on nitrogen release off their organic matter. So it kind of depends on, honestly, essentially who taught you how to do it. But if you were doing a fertilizer recommendation for 45 bushel canola crop, first you'd have to decide how much that canola crop is going to take out, like total uptake rates. So that again is a bit of a range, but for canola I use 3.3. So your total nitrogen would be 45 pounds times a 3.3. So you're looking at 149 pounds of total N that you would need. And then you'd have to look at your soil sample and see how much nitrate nitrogen is there and how much you're going to get released from your organic matter. This sample in particular, it's one that's sent in some of my guys, and it's like an unreal amount of nitrate nitrogen. Generally, it should not be this high because in the there's 79 pounds, and this is taken in the fall, so that is fairly high. But if we just actually base this off of there, so you'd subtract the 79 pounds that are available in your soil, and then whatever number you would use for your organic matter. So for example, the way I usually figure it out would be 3.1% organic matter, and I usually figure 6 pounds of N released, actually available released nitrogen for the year. So 3.1 times 6 would be roughly 19 pounds. And then those are your total N in between your nitrate and your organic matter. So we figured out 149 for the requirement for 45 bushels, minus your 79 nitrate, minus 19 from organic matter. You need to put down 51 pounds of N. And then you could do that with every other nutrient that's on here. Like I said in mine, sulfur usually very variable in the soil. If you hit one hot spot, it can throw off your results here. So I would just do a ratio. So we needed 149 pounds total N divided by 5, because it's 5-to-1 ratio. So you'd need 30 pounds sulfur. Do you want me to go through all the nutrients, or is that enough?
That should be good. Thank you so much, Sam. Looks like we have maybe one last question. Does the type of soil residue on the soil surface have any effect on the amount or rate of urea? For example, this viewer harvests corn and then they plant a wheat crop and create that corn crop residue on the soil surface. So would that have any, I guess, effects on the amount or the rate of urea needed?
I want to say kind of yes and no right now, and either John, Kim, or Sam correct me if you have anything contradictory. But when you look at those high residue crops, you're gonna see a net, or high C to N ratio residue crops. You're gonna see a net mobilization to start off with, but it will, as that crop progresses, it will start to mineralize and be able to uptake that. So, when you start to see that first, I know there's a picture out there of some nitrogen deficient corn in a high residue, corn on corn. I'm not sure where I saw that, but it was the same. I talked about the same idea and how that high residue, high carbon nitrogen residue net immobilized a lot of that nitrogen to start off with, and the corn sort of yellowed off at that 2 to 3 leaf stage, but then it came back. Now, if we remember from John's presentation yesterday, when you look at the wheat, it's going to take up a big chunk of its nitrogen during that up from seeding up to tillering. So, when you look at applications on the soil surface and if it's getting immobilized in that high residue, high carbon nitrogen residue, you could definitely be looking at potential yield losses by having that nitrogen being tied up and not immediately accessible to that crop.
Great.
So I guess
Mike.
on the rate side of things, yeah, you might need to look at bumping that rate up if it's going to be tying it up that much. But I don't know if John, Kim, or Sam, if you have anything contrary to that.
My only suggestion would be the placement becomes critical there. I mean, if you're banding into the ground through that residue, the potential for losses of that nitrogen is much less than if we broadcast on top of that residue. I think that's the other piece that probably has to be accounted for, is placement probably makes a huge difference with heavy crop residue on the surface.
Great, thanks everyone. Going back to the soil test example, do you assume that all the phos in the soil test is available?
No. So it's, I mean, it depends on your soil too. It can get really tied up by your like magnesium, calcium if you have high pH soils. That too totally depends on who's doing it, but the number that shows on there is definitely not 100% available. Mike, do you have any other comments?
Nope, I agree with you.
Great, and just building on that, do you always consider the values in the total 12 inches of the soil sample? Is there any value in looking at 0 to 6 inches or 7 to 12 or even higher?
I personally would prefer a 0 to 6 than a 6 to 12 because I feel like it gives you a better idea of your organic matter. But again, totally depends on the person and what they're looking for, what they're planning on doing with the soil sample.
Great, and Mike, if you want to go back to that hummocky soil example, maybe we'll just follow up on that question. Which was, can you just remind us what a hummocky field or soil looks like?
Yeah, so you're looking at, not the Regina Plains. It's not going to be flat. It's going to have a lot more highly variable elevation changes in the field. And you're likely going to see that, this is an extreme case where you're starting to see that B horizon poke through, and you can see that difference between like the A to the B, and the B's are starting to poke through on the knolls. We don't have, I guess, out in my area, and I'm in that Humboldt office. If you go towards that Bruno area, you're going to be looking at some seriously hummocky landscapes in there. We don't really see much for the B horizon poking out in those. There's not a lot of land out in this area that gets tilled black like this, so you won't really see it. But you're looking at, if you like riding snowmobiles, there's some fun to be had in the hills out by Bruno.
Great, thanks. Looks like the final question. Can you comment on nutrient immobilization due to a high C to N ratio?
If I can take a crack at it here. So the immobilization for the high C to N ratios is going to be based on the soil microorganisms. So when you have more free available nitrogen in crop residue, that leaves, you know, the soil microorganisms can use that nitrogen, and then there's some left over to get tied up into the soil solution, and it's free to plants. Now, if you have high carbon residues and you're putting a lot of carbon into that soil and not as much nitrogen, and those microbes are using that nitrogen and tying the nitrogen up in their cells, that's when you're looking at immobilization. Those microbes are, you know, they're mobile in the soil. They might be moving like micrometers, but they're mobile, and they're more mobile than plant roots, so they can get to that nitrogen before a plant root could possibly get to that nitrogen as well. So then you're waiting for those microbes to die and decay, and then that nitrogen becomes freely available to those plants there. So that's where that ratio comes in, and how it can tie up with within soil microorganisms.
Great, thanks, Mike. Maybe just one last quick question. When looking at a soil test to make potassium recommendations, do you pay much attention to the K to mg ratio?
It's one of the things I look at. I don't think it should be the only thing you look at. There's lots of different opinions on that, and I've seen a couple fights break out on Twitter recently for that. But there's three things you should really look for, which is, the first one is your parts per million potassium, your K to mg, and your percent K. So there's critical levels for all of those, and it's just kind of keep all three of those in mind and not just focus on one.
Great, thanks everyone. And thank you again, Sam and Mike, for the awesome presentations. As well, at this time, we would like to thank everybody for taking the time to join us for our event. If you had entered your CCA number during registration, we will make sure to send those along to the appropriate person in order for you to receive credit. As a reminder, credits are only available to those who have viewed the webinar live. As mentioned as well, all webinar recordings will be shared with you tomorrow, as well as an event evaluation. So please take the time to fill that out, as that does help us steer our extension programs in the future, as well as prioritize research needs. As well, the recordings will be placed on our website. So if you visit saskatchewan.ca and just enter webinars into the search bar, it should take you to our collection of webinars that we have had over the last couple of years. So if anyone has any questions regarding any of the topics that we talked about this week for 4R or anything else, please contact your local Saskatchewan Regional Office or the Agricultural Knowledge Center at 1-866-457-2377, and we will be sure to put you in contact with a specialist to help answer your questions. Thanks again for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day.